Hey American literature friends, this is a terminology video in which we're going to go through the Harlem Renaissance. You can see right here, just on a basic level, the Harlem Renaissance was the first major self-conscious, by African Americans and in many ways for African Americans, self-aware literary movement of African American writers in the United States. Although there had been black writing since even before there was a United States, and it's easy to connect and think back to a writer like Phyllis Wheatley, African American woman writer from the time period of the American Revolution. But the Harlem Renaissance is this big explosion of African American literature and art and culture, especially in the 1920s. After World War I, as a result of the Great Migration, if you're not familiar with the Great Migration, it was this mass move of African Americans, mostly from the American South, to places in the American North, especially industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York, Harlem and New York City. Many young, talented writers and artists congregated in the Harlem area of New York City, also the Bronzeville area on the south side of Chicago and in Detroit, and they made those places, and especially Harlem, a cultural and intellectual capital. Significant figures from the Harlem Renaissance include the writer Langston Hughes, the poet Countee Cullen, the writer Zora Neale Hurston, and Jean Toomer from Georgia. The Harlem Renaissance diminished considerably with the onset of the Great Depression, but really, in many ways, pressed forward into the 1930s. By the time you get to the late 1930s, the Great Depression has been going on for like a decade. There's the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, and it really kills off the Harlem Renaissance. The combination of the threat of the coming Second World War and the economic depression really kills it off. But the Harlem Renaissance lasts for 10, 15, arguably even 20 years. To dig a little deeper into it and what started it and what it looked like, at the time it was called the New Negro Movement, named after this anthology that came out in 1925. And like I said, although it was centered in the Harlem neighborhood, it was a catch-all. The Harlem Renaissance is a catch-all for this cultural explosion of African American art and literature that was happening all over North America, even beyond the United States. As they tell you right here, and in 1929, the year of the stock market crash, that was really the beginning of the end of the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance is considered to have been a rebirth of African American arts. If you skip down here and want to think about the things that caused it and led to it, let's see if we can scroll back up here to the development aspect of it. Here we go. Harlem became an African American neighborhood in the early 1900s, and many more African Americans. The beginning of the Great Migration was many of these African Americans who served in the United States Army in World War I and then came back to a country that really did not appreciate them or recognize them as equal citizens. And in the first 20 years of the 20th century, from that 1900 to 1920, you had this series of race riots and violence against African Americans that began in the South but really spread to other parts of the country. Is in places in the North that African Americans fought back. There were race riots beginning in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. There was one in Atlanta in 1906. There was another one in New Orleans. There were all these, the Tulsa race riot of 1920. Race riots and other civil uprisings occurred throughout the United States during the Red Summer of 1919. The Red Summer of 1919 is seen as this sort of low, awful point of all these race riots because these people, the African Americans, all the soldiers come back from World War I, and there is this heightened tension in the fall and winter of 1919 and then into 1920. For a lot of African Americans, that was the sort of breaking point. They were like, we're done with the American South. We're going away for better opportunities, like I said, to places like Detroit, Chicago, Harlem, those areas. So you have this surge in violence. The riots and killings were extensively documented. There was also this national fear during World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution had happened in Russia, and so there was the beginning of this rising fear of socialism and communism and things like that. And even from the beginning, there was this fear that the riots that were happening, the race riots that were happening in the South and then spread through the rest of the country, might lead to something like the Bolshevik Revolution and some kind of overthrow or government unrest in the United States too. So all of that combined to create these conditions where African Americans left the rural South and went to these industrialized cities in the North. And then you begin to have this mainstream recognition of Harlem culture and African American culture. And then the literature, you can see literature was an important part of the Harlem Renaissance. The big literary people are Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Gene Toomer, the writer from Georgia that I already mentioned. But there's a lot of other aspects of the Harlem Renaissance, everything from jazz and the birth of like blues and jazz music that you get in the 1920s, and these clubs in Harlem that people from all over New York City begin to flock to have this unique experience with African American culture and arts and music, right all the way down to these unique hair salons that open in Harlem to begin to cater to African Americans. So there's all kinds of layers to the Harlem Renaissance, from art and literature and music all the way down to material culture like hair salons and places like that. If you want more information about the Harlem Renaissance, or you want to dig deeper into it, or one of the writers or artists of it, I'm happy to help you do that. Just be in touch with me. But like I said, we're talking about a period that begins roughly after World War I, 1919, 1920. The high point of the Harlem Renaissance is really that 1925 to 1929 period, and then you have the stock market crash in 1929. The Harlem Renaissance carries through the 1930s, but then by the late 1930s, as Nazism and fascism are rising in Europe and the Great Depression has gone on, it really sort of brings an end to the Harlem Renaissance. But it does have a good 20 years, including that sort of 4 or 5 year surge in the late 1920s. If you want to know more, reach out to me and we can dig a little deeper into it. Otherwise, hopefully that's a useful introduction to the Harlem Renaissance for you all.